Welcome to part 3 of Managing Emerging Technologies series. Well, we have covered S-curve, the hype curve, and today we're going to talk about the chasm, which is actually the market adoption. Let's revise the S-curve. Well, the S-curve, we have an existing paradigm and a new paradigm, which is the emerging technologies that you can analyze to take over or eventually will take over the existing paradigm. All right, compare your MP3 player versus the Discman, compare your WhatsApp or Telegram against the SMS. And then we talk about beyond the S-curve, there's this thing called a hype curve, which is really the part that have the peak or irrational exuberance, the peak expectations, inflated expectations. So I think this is very important to know how do you strategize. Then the Gartner hype curve actually provide you a lot more data. They look at number of years at when a piece of technology will eventually reach the expected performance, and that is a real solid performance. And we can see that when you overlay the hype curve and S-curve, it really makes sense that they are, one is grounded in performance and one is grounded in expectations. And the question is, how do you manage them? Now today we're going to talk about the adoption of this emerging technology in the market. Unlike traditional technologies, for example, fast-moving consumer good or FMCG, or existing technologies that have been there for a long time, mass market adoptions, you do incremental improvement, people have roughly know what it is, and people will get used to it. However, when you're looking at emerging technology, it is not that simple. Now let's start with something where it's easier to understand called the technology adoption curve. Anybody who wants to adopt or new technologies that comes into the market generally have to go through this phase. First, with the innovators, people who want to take on new things, right? So the first iPad that came out, there are a couple of people who are actually interested, and then after that, early adopters. So the people who are innovator takes it, the early adopters love it. But then after that, what is really interesting to you is the majority market. That's the mass market. And in majority market, you have the early majority. They are comfortable, they're willing to try, but they will not take risks. And the late majority, they will never take risks. However, they comprises 68% of the market. And that is very important because that is where you want to go in order to be the leading player in the field. All right, so that is the technology adoption curve to diffuse your emerging technology into the market. Now the question then is this. Research done by Jeffrey Moss actually say that, well, there is a difference between the early market, and the early market comprises of innovators and early adopters, and the late market, early majority, and late majority. So we are saying about 68% versus 2.5 versus plus 13.5%, that's about 16%. 16% versus 68%, right? So what Geoffrey Moore in Crossing the Chasm is trying to say is that early market requirements is quite different from the late market. And they say this early market prefers something as a minimum feature set, very minimum set of product, while the late market want the whole product, everything, insurance, service center, everything must be in place. It's just like you go to the bank, right? The bank will never buy any new products that is not yet fully proven in the market. It's like a lot of big companies will not buy things that from a small startup because they're not too sure what is it all about, right? So there is definitely a chasm here. Well, and Geoffrey Moore further goes on and say that actually it's not just the chasm, it is that from the start of innovators and early adopters, there will be a chasm that you need to cross over. That means you have repackaged your product, and there's a strategy called bowling alley. How do you cross the chasm? And then when you cross the chasm and there's a mass market adoption, there'll be a tornado, which is a strategy you have to change. And after that become mainstream where everybody start competing, and so it's a +1 strategy. I'm better than you by one feature or something like that. All right? So the management patterns and the management techniques and the strategies got to change along all these different market segments. But the most important thing is really the chasm. How do you cross the chasm? What it's trying to say is that if you are in emerging technology and you take this whole technology, drive it as a product and try to sell, and sell to a certain point up to that 13%, and suddenly the market dries up and the big guys are not buying from you, you collapse. That is a big issue. How do you cross over to become the major market share leader? Well, so the bowling pin strategy. So in the bowling alley, what is being discussed and shown is that if we take application 1 and segment 1, and assuming segment 1 is 13% or 16% market, so there's a chasm for you to cross. And the bowling alley strategy says you start with segment 1 and application 1, and then you actually move around with different market segments. Okay, so that sounds simple. There are two things that you need to take care of. Customer preference means customer refer to another customer, but geographical sort of expansion, and the whole product, which is basically using features, making the product better and better so that more and more features. All right, let's take that as an overall strategy and see how do we actually work it out. One of the important criteria is in Geoffrey Moore saying is this: for every market segment, every pin, you should be the big fish in a small pond. Don't try to be a small fish in the sea. All right? What you want to do is to define the market such that your product can sell and you are the number one. So some people say, so what really does it mean? Well, physically means if you define a market of 100 million and you don't have resources to reach 50, which is the majority player, let's say, then don't try. Then you may want to size the market to 50 so that you can become the majority in the market. So you resize a big market to small ones such that you have the resource to take over the market. So this is actually what is being done in Facebook. So Facebook, when it first started, is in the dorm, right? And Mark Zuckerberg actually started off in Harvard. He opened up to the Harvard University students only. Facebook was only available to anybody who has a Harvard email account. Then he opened up, once you corner the Harvard students, the major player, then it opens up and eventually opens up to the world. All right, so how do we actually practice this? So we should have a beachhead, a point that we want to enter, and this is what we call A1, M1, application 1 and market 1. So application 1 is a product, market 1 is the geography of the product, the market segment. And we can go A1, M2, so the A remains the same, the product remains the same, but the market is expanded. Remember, the ball or pin get bigger and bigger. And then we can go along that way, this means go by geography. Or we can actually improve the products, right? So A2, which is a A1 plus features with M1, and then you go this way. So what happened is that when you go either way, this way or that way, there's only one variable change. A1 never change, M1 never change. And when you come to this point, M2 and A2, there's no risk because you know the market already. All right? So that's how you cross the chasm using the bowling pin strategy. Now the question is then, how can we compute, right? Because we said that the market itself, you must be the biggest player, and that depends on the resource. So let's take a very simple example. If you have 1 million fund, whether from VCs or from a family or friends or grants, and your cost of goods sold is 1 million. So you have cost of goods sold is 1 million, and you put that 1 million into manufacturing. All right, and let's say assuming you can sell at a gross margin of 80%. That's great. So which means your sales is 5 million. Your cost of goods sold is 1 million. That's where your original resource is, and therefore you make a GP or gross profit of 4 million. That's great. So which means you've got to define your market such that the market is simply going to be 10 million. Because sales of 5 million, market 10 million, you are 50% of the market share. So it's good. Then then you go on to the next spin. And if you look at the next spin, because right now your resources, the gross profit is 4 million, so you should start with 4 million funding, cost of goods sold is 4 million, maintain the gross margin of 80%, that will result in 4 million is 20%, therefore 100% is 20 million, cost of goods sold still 4 million, now your gross profit of 60 million. Well, if you have gross profit of 60 million and the sales is 20 million, and if you have 50% market share, you define your market here should be times 2, 40. So you have grown from 10 to 40 million, right? So it is not just a linear growth, right? It's an exponential growth or highly accelerated of 10 million to 40 million, while still maintaining yourself as the largest company or biggest share in the market segment that you define. And that is how we cross the chasm, by meticulous planning.